Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the session. Now we still have a couple minutes to wait until we actually start the event. So if you want to grab a cup of coffee or a glass of water, feel free and go ahead.
In this kind of situation, a student once said to me, "Why don't you just tell a joke to bridge the time?" And since then, I'm still thinking about a good joke to tell in such moments. I still haven't succeeded, actually, to find one. But this is definitely something still on my list. So, yeah.
That's a good idea, yeah. Okay, I think we can start with a quick introduction. So once again, hello and welcome everyone to the third webinar of our Elements of AI series for Luxembourg. So I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Dauphin. Today I'm joined by Dr. Alexander Steen, who will give us a short talk on his research topic today. So Dr. Alexander Steen is a postdoc researcher at the University of Luxembourg. He's working in the individual and collective reasoning research group. He obtained his PhD in 2018 from the Free University of Berlin. And he was also nominated as AI newcomer in 2019 by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. So we're very happy to have such a distinguished guest with us today. His research focuses on the theory and practice of higher order reasoning. And in his talk today, he will tell us about logic and automated reasoning, or machine languages for everything. So this is a topic which is not really covered in the online material of the course. So I hope you will enjoy the talk. And as a short reminder, we'll also answer all the questions you may have at the end of the session, but you can already feel free to type them during the talk in the chat, and then we'll answer them afterwards. So please, Alexander, go ahead with your talk.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, and also, of course, for the invitation to give a webinar here. And also from my side, welcome to everybody of you to the third webinar. So as Jeremy already mentioned, this topic of this webinar is, at least to my knowledge, also quite orthogonal, or at least a bit, well, complementary in a sense to the topics of the online course. But I hope that this will still be interesting for you, especially because this is then a topic that has not been covered by the remaining resources. Okay, so what it will be about is about logic and automated reasoning, and we'll see within the talk what this is really about. But before we do so, let's start with a vision, and I can already give a spoiler here, the vision that has not been implemented so far, unfortunately. So this is the vision of the German mathematician Leibniz. He said, if we had it, a characteristica universalis, or a universal language, we should be able to reason in metaphysics and morals in much the same way as in geometry and analysis. And the interesting aspect here is the characteristica universalis, so the universal language, in which we could actually write down our disputes or our reasoning attempts. The vision is even a bit wider. The idea is given here by a quote of Leibniz. I will just read it quickly. If controversies were to arise, there would be no more need for disputation between two philosophers than between two calculators. For it would suffice for them to take the pencils in their hands and to sit down at the abacus and to say to each other, "Let us calculate." Of course, this was not translated by me from Latin, but okay. The important aspects are here that there should be no more need of disputation. It would suffice to say, "Let us calculate." Of course, the abacus in our case would be probably the computer today, or an electronic version of it. But this is really the ultimate goal that we have in mind. It would suffice to say, "Let us calculate." The idea here is that, I hope you can see my cursor. At the very left side, we have some kind of dispute between two persons. And the idea is to write down the information or the contents of this dispute in some kind of language that is universal enough to capture the arguments. And then also that is formal enough to then just do a calculation on that information or on that representation of the dispute and then have a formal result. In our case, what Leibniz called the characteristica universalis would be the language in which this formalized dispute would be written down, and the calculation would be done with a so-called calculus rationator, so inference of rational things, right? In our interpretation, or in my interpretation at least, characteristica universalis could be something like logic, and the calculations would be something like reasoning, or in our case, automated reasoning, because we want to have the reasoning aspects on the machine. I'll put here question marks to the equation sign, because it's not really clear if logic can really be the universal language here, or if this can be implemented by automated reasoning. But still, this is the idea or the path that we will go down. So this is the vision. The question is now, what does this has to do with AI? So how does this vision connect to artificial intelligence? Actually, automated reasoning and aspects of that were already, since the very beginning of AI research in the 50s, a core subfield of AI, and is now, of course, in the public appearance, I think, a bit overwhelmed by machine learning and related techniques. This is also why it's sometimes today referred to as good old-fashioned AI. Also in a more scientific way, we would call it symbolic AI. And here, the idea is that what we just saw in Leibniz vision as a dispute doesn't really need to be like a dispute between two people who argue about who is right or wrong about some very personal topic, but this can be actually anything. So if we abstract from the word dispute, a dispute can be quite general. It can be something that is being done in a decision process within a bank. So a question to dispute or to decide upon is this person eligible for a loan or not? In a context of an autonomous vehicle, this could be, which action should I actually take, where I am now the autonomous vehicle? In facial recognition, well, the question could be, is this really the picture of some person? In planning, this could be, I think this was also addressed a bit in the course material planning, which is the shortest route. And here, the dispute would be, well, to settle down on some answer to these questions. And of course, this is about taking decisions or executing some actions, and now we have to dispute about which action to take or which decision to use. And here, the dispute is again the thing that we want to decide upon. This is then somehow represented in a formal language. Then we do the reasoning, and then hopefully at the end we have some kind of decision or action to take. And here, the representation of the things that we want to decide upon are formalized in some kind of logical language, and then the question what really now can be concluded from this information can also be done by logic. So in terms of reasoning, of reasoning inference steps. So, and this is of course an essential component of AI systems to decide upon things, to take actions as they see fit. And of course, we hope that they take good decisions. And this is also why we probably want to know how they decide these things. And this is also addressed in symbolic AI or in automated reasoning as a subfield of that. The question now here is, of course, what is really a logic? So what can we understand under the broad term of logic? And so first of all, there's no single logic, but there are a lot of different systems in different languages and different principles that are distinct logical systems. But usually, and this is a quite rough view, so of course this is a bit informal in some aspects, is that a logic is composed of, well, at least two things. It's a language itself, so the logic itself is also a language, but it's also a collection of reasoning patterns. And we will see now in the following minutes what I mean with language and reasoning patterns. So a language, of course, we all do know languages, otherwise you would not understand me now. So we're not talking in English, which is a language, but it's not the language that we want to use in logic, at least. But in logic, we have a controlled language that is a form of restricted language formalism, where you can build up sentences by using smaller blocks and composing them into larger structures. And these building blocks are usually some of these. This list is by far not exhaustive, so there are a lot more to address. But for instance, it could be something not A, where A is now some other statement. It could be A and B, A or B, or if A then B. So this is usually referred to as negation, conjunction, disjunction, and implication. And here are the formal systems. I put them in gray. It's not too important what the formal systems, the formal symbols here are. But the important thing is that we have a quite limited set of schemes on how to produce sentences in that language. The question is, what is the benefit in doing so? The main benefit of having a formal language is that it's unambiguous. If we have a sentence in the English language, for instance here, time flies like an arrow, what do we really mean with that? Probably you will now know what I mean with this sentence because it's a proverb, but this requires some intuition. And of course, we do know that computers cannot think the way we do. This is not really helpful, right? Because an interpretation could also be there is a specific species of flies called time flies, and these time flies like a specific arrow. So they adore this kind of arrow. Of course, a second interpretation could be that time, when considered as some object in our reality, flies through space like an arrow. I mean, that doesn't really make sense, but it could be what we meant with that sentence. Of course, also the third thing, time passes quite quickly. This is of course the thing that we actually mean. But we can see here that English as language is ambiguous, and by using a restricted logical language, we come around these kind of downsides. The second part is a collection of reasoning patterns, which is roughly a collection of recipes on how to deal with these kind of formal language expressions. So how do we combine these language expressions to deduce new information? So this, you could call it rules for argumentation if you want so. And of course, they are also important just in philosophy or in argumentation. outside of formal logic, but here in formal logic we have them too. For instance, if we have some implication, if A then B, and if this holds, and we do know that A holds, then we can follow that B holds. I mean, it makes sense, right? If A then B, and we know A, then we also know B. This is called modus ponens. Or if we know that A or B holds and not A holds, then we know that B must hold because A or B holds. This is called the modus tollens. And these are just examples. They are far more complex recipes, if you want so. But this is then how we can deal with expressions and deduce new information from existing information. A small example here would be, we have 3 sentences here. It's daytime or it's nighttime. In a logical language, I could, for instance, write it down like day or night. If the sun is shining, it's not nighttime. Sun implies not night. So if the sun is shining, this implies, or then it's not nighttime. And the third input is the sun is shining, so sun is true. And then by application, I don't know if you really see that, but here, if we apply the modus ponens once, then we know that not night is true. And by modus tollens, then we know that day is true. So we can conclude by the rules of that logic that it follows its daytime. Of course, this is now a quite simple example. This could be arbitrarily complex, but this is the basic idea of logics. So at one side, a language, at the other side, rules on how to work with that language. The question now is, okay, now we have a logic, and this could also be quite philosophical. How is this useful in AI? And for that reason, I will briefly go over 3 different kinds of reasoning patterns that you might stumble upon also in AI systems. And one thing that you probably might also know, probably from Sherlock Holmes, because I think that Sherlock Holmes quite often says, I deduce something. And what does it mean? Well, I deduce something. This is a form of reasoning called deduction, where we have some kind of rules. So this here is now a rule, if A then B, like a general rule that we assume to be true. And if I know A, then I also know B. This is, well, what you seen also in the modus ponens case. But what I mean here is now in the deduction case is I know the rules, I know the current situation, and now I want to search for which conclusions I can actually draw from this information. So I have given the rules, I've been given the rules and the situation. The question is, what follows from that as a deductive step? What can be inferred from that? This is the most prominent reasoning thing in logic, I would say. But we also have induction. Induction is that we do not have the rules and the situation, but we have the situation and the conclusions, but we don't know the general rules. And in inductive reasoning, we look at the situation, we look at outcomes, we compare them, and we want to learn what general rules can be inferred in an inductive way from that. So we are given the situation and the conclusions, and we search for the rules. And as a third one, abduction. Of course, abduction should not now mean that somebody will steal a person from the street, but abductive reasoning. And in abductive reasoning, we are given the rules and also the conclusions, and we are searching for the most likely explanation of the current situation. This is, we want to interpolate, if you want so, or extrapolate what the situation must have been, because we know the rules and we know the current situation, right? So these are 3 different kinds of reasoning. And, oops, sorry, this was one too far. This is used in AI. Well, in deductive reasoning, we can easily think of, we know some rules and situation. Okay, I need to decide on actions. The prototypical use case is here. I need to decide on things. I observe my surroundings. I know the rules, for instance, in an autonomous car. What do I need to do now? In induction, we want to learn something. We want to learn principles of the world. So we're just looking at data sets or at observations in general, and we want to learn about the world. This is especially helpful if we do not know the rules, but we want to somehow learn them from the data. And in abduction, the third case, this is usually used for explaining actions or for explaining situations, the most likely situations. So this can be used for explaining things. And these are three aspects that are arguably quite prominent in AI systems, all three of them. But I will now highlight these two here on the left because of the time constraints. But of course, abduction is also an important aspect of that. Now we look at automated deduction. Automated deduction is what these systems that are called reasoning systems in the beginning will actually do, and also the systems that I'm working on. First, maybe a hint or a note what automated deduction is not. So it's not machine learning. Machine learning, as we just saw in the other side, in machine learning, we are trying to learn patterns or learning general rules. And automated deduction is not machine learning, so it's not associated with supervised, unsupervised learning, etc. But machine learning is related to inductive reasoning. As you've just seen, in inductive reasoning, we are trying to come up with patterns. This is exactly what machine learning, plus minus, is doing. So we are arguing using empirical evidence. So we don't know the rules, but we have empirical evidence, we have observations, and we're trying to come up with quite general rules. But of course, the important thing here, and this is also why sometimes machine learning systems also criticized, is that, of course, observations do not necessarily imply the actual causality, which means that just because I saw something and I found a pattern, it doesn't mean that this pattern is generally true. So it could be the case that I'm learning something which is in fact not universally correct in that sense. And of course, this has a quite a tremendous influence, especially if you look at AI systems that should be reliable, right? Where you want to rely that something is correct. So let's look at an example. We here have a bag of coins, and we are picking some coins out of that. So in the first pick, we take a penny, or we get a penny, and the second, it's again a penny, and a third pick, it's again a penny. Okay, so what I will do now in inductive reasoning, I will generalize my observation into a rule, hopefully a rule, that now every coin in that bag is a penny. Of course, it's quite obvious also for you that it could still be the case that there are other coins in the bag than just pennies, right? So the point is here that the sample set or the set of observations is just too small to actually cover the all generality of the matter. This is also, of course, an ethical question, because in this example, we're looking now on ancestry. So if my grandfather is bald and Jeremy's grandfather is also bald, we might come to the inductive conclusion that all grandfathers are bald. But here again, the learning set might be biased. So so this learning set was also quite small, but still we could think about a learning set of thousands of grandfathers, and they are all bald. So this can happen then, of course, that we learn that grandfathers are bald. And still, these kind of biases in the learning sets, of course, might be there by accident or not. We might know that they are there, or we might not know that they are there, etc. And of course, this also raises the problem of learning things that might be biased towards some direction. In automated deduction, now the other part, it's also some kind of learning, but we are not learning rules, but we are learning what follows from these rules, or what follows from our knowledge. Arguably, one could say it's something like information discovery, if you want so, and this is not real learning. But then again, we could have a lot of facts and a lot of things that we know, but this doesn't mean that we also know everything that follows from our knowledge. So automated deduction is now something where we learn what actually follows from our knowledge. And the key difference here to machine learning is that automated deduction, as you might already conclude in a deductive way or inductive way maybe, from the name, it represents deductive reasoning. So we are arguing, or we are following using inference or argumentation steps that are based on deductive reasoning, on logic. So don't get me wrong here. There are also logics for doing abduction and induction, but here we're now in the context of deduction, so applying logical inference rules to derive conclusions. And the good thing here is that these conclusions are sound in a way that they are always true. Otherwise, I mean, we have to, of course, make sure that our recipes for argumentation are themselves sound and correct. But if they are, all our deductive conclusions will also be correct, sound, and they will be reliably correct. So I can look at my argumentation afterwards, and I can check whether I made a mistake in my argumentation or not. But if I check that, then of course, and I come to the conclusion that I didn't do any mistake, then I know that this is actually reliable truth, right? So as a first example, consider the bust here on the right. If we have some kind of rule that says if X being something, is a human, then X is mortal, we can say, yeah, arguably this is probably true. And Socrates, also the bust here on the right, is a human, or was a human, I don't know. The question is now, therefore, is Socrates also mortal? And yes, of course, we can derive that quite simply, because it's implicitly already contained in the rules and the facts that we are. Still, we learned now that Socrates himself is mortal, although this was not contained as piece of information in our initial knowledge base, if you want so. Of course, the downside here is that if we don't have enough knowledge or enough rules, then we cannot conclude the same thing for other persons. So if we know X is human, then X is mortal, and now Socrates is human, as we've just seen, and now we're asking, therefore, is Plato mortal? Well, we don't know, not necessarily. It depends. It could be if Plato is a human. It could not be if Plato is not a human, but we did not specify here that Plato is in fact a human. And of course, he might also be mortal for other reasons. But I mean, you see the point that we need some kind of information to do the actual arguing or the argumentation steps. And of course, this is has some pros and cons. So the advantages here is that we do not have false results, in a sense, false negatives or false positives. So we are doing deductive reasoning, and this is to some sense explainable because we can just explain how I derived that conclusion. Of course, the disadvantage here is that I need to translate my domain knowledge into this logical language, and this is a lot of work. This is really expensive. Right. Okay, so now we've seen logic and the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, which is usually like machine learning and automated deduction systems. And how is that now employed in AI, so as a concrete mechanism in applied AI? What we usually do, if we have some kind of word problem, this can be anything really, we need to translate this to a logic problem. This is what I just said. This can be quite intricate, quite non-trivial. This will be about relevant facts about the world, which we usually would call axioms in the logical context. And of course, also what we want to be solved, the conjecture. What we will then do is we invoke a reasoning system. This is really a computer software that will read this logic problem and do the reasoning for us, and then will give us a solution, which can either be a certificate saying, yes, this is in fact true, I did my reasoning, and here's a proof, and I can even check the proof, or it can come up with a counterexample and say, well, this is not necessarily true, there might be cases where this is not true, and I can give an explanation here. In either case, really to make use of this information, we again need to translate back the solution to the real world, so to interpret it in a way in order to make use of this information. For instance, this could be something where a verification machine found a bug in some software, so we need to interpret the results, we need to understand the results, and then we can use this information to improve our software. This is then the step here back to the word solution. How are these proofs found? So how do these automatic deduction systems actually work? So this is quite technical, so I didn't put too much technical details in here. But the idea is that we have some inference rules. This is what we called before the rules of argumentation, and these are somehow implemented in some kind of programming language. And then the system tries to apply these inference rules, these argumentation steps, in a certain manner to derive some intermediate conclusions and even more intermediate conclusions until the system will finally find the argumentation step towards the final goal, well, the conjecture that we wanted to prove or that we wanted to deduce. And this will then actually be a mathematical proof. So we can use it just like any mathematical proof. And the benefits of that is that proofs can be verified, even externally. So if we do not trust our own system, we can print out the proof, even if our system has not been verified to be correct, but we can look at the proof and let somebody else check the proof. Because if the proof is sound, if the proof is correct, then the result will be correct, even if there are some bugs in our software. Of course, it can also act as an explicit justification, but these proofs do not necessarily look nice. So even me, and I would argue now that at least for automated deduction system, because I programmed them also myself, they are hard to understand, these proofs. And I will show you a small example here. So don't be alarmed. You are not supposed to understand that. It's just an illustration. And sometimes I also don't understand what's written there. The system outputs, so the proofs are in a way machine-oriented. They are not really there for humans to check. I mean, in principle, you could check this as a human, but it would take some time. You can see here that, so this is a proof output. This is actually a mathematical proof that will be outputted by such a system in this kind of syntactical output file standard that is called TPTP-THF. This is a community standard on how to print out proofs. And now you could see that, yeah, there's some formula. I know how this is derived from some earlier formula in a deductive reasoning step. And of course, I can check this step by step. But this is not what we want to do, right? The idea is that we want to be able to do that. But then again, some other machine or software could check this for us, or even just save it as a log somewhere. If later somebody wants to check why did some mistake happen, okay, we need to look at these proofs as a protocol, and we can then check what happened there. Actually, this proof was generated by my own prover, which I'm quite happy about, that this is at least to some extent a quite good prover. So it's called Leo 3, which I implemented as part of my PhD studies, and we even won a small trophy here. So the trophy is made of plastic, so it's not that expensive, but still. Was actually at some point world champion in finding these proofs, because these proofs might be arbitrarily complex. And of course, the challenge here is to have a system that can prove as much as possible and hopefully also as fast as possible, because we want to use it in productive environments. Okay. This is now how the proving works and what automated deduction is, and how these systems will work with that. We will now have a brief look in the last 8 minutes or so on some application examples, because I think this is also a good thing to grasp where these things are actually employed. And I really liked the title of this talk that I heard some years ago. Everything's bigger in Texas, largest math proof ever. A very classical application of automated deduction or automated reasoning systems in general is in mathematics, computer science, and verification. This is what I would call the boring applications, not because they are not relevant, they are quite relevant actually, but they are in a way standard and classical. They are so obvious to use machine software to verify or to automate proofs, because, well, we are in logic and we're automating logic. Of course, we're doing that. Still, this is quite relevant, because here in this example, for instance, there was an open mathematical problem called the Pythagorean triples problem. It's not now really important what this problem is about. It's related to Ramsey theories, or a quite theoretic branch of mathematics. But this was an open a problem that was for a long time open, and actually an automated reasoning system found that this conjecture does not hold, and found a counterexample for this. So it actually contributed novel information to the mathematics society or community in helping to find proofs or counterexamples in this context. And here the impressive thing is that the proof that was created by the system was 200 terabytes big. And I think currently hard drives are somewhere between 500 gigabytes and maybe 1 terabyte. So this would amount to something like 200 or 400 hard disk drives just full of these cryptic proofs that you just seen here, right? I mean, of course, they're represented in a much more compressed way, so it's even denser. But you can see this is a lot of information to process. And here, 16,000 hours of CPU time were actually used to find this proof or this counterexample in that scenario. So this is a lot of information to shift around, but it's productive in a way. So it contributed novel knowledge. Also, another classical application is software verification, which is a very, very important branch, because it's about safety critical and mission critical parts of hardware systems or software systems. And obviously, especially if somewhere humans are involved, then we want to make sure that software or hardware errors will not harm humans. Of course, also probably that the software or the hardware is correct, or that some errors might never happen. But the most important thing, of course, is that living things will not be harmed. And this is also what is being done. For instance, at NASA, NASA Langley, this is a logo here, they use the software system called PVS. It's also a deduction system for proving the correctness of software components that are actually sent to, okay, I actually don't know where they sent it to Mars or to the moon or outer space. I'm not sure exactly. But of course, arguably, this must be correct, because they cannot have an error in there. If the satellite is somewhere behind the moon, you cannot fix it, right? So it needs to be correct at first try. And also, for instance, at the end SNCF, so at the French train corporation, they use, for instance, SPIN or Promella as a language for verifying train systems. I think it was about signal coordination. And this is just a very small excerpt of where these things are employed. Right. Another, I think, a bit more modern approach is to also use these systems, symbolic AI systems, in normative reasoning and computational law, which is then a subfield, if you want, of AI and law, where of course also machine learning systems will be relevant. And here, for instance, there are new standards on how to express legal or normative documents in a machine-readable way. For instance, legal rule ML or legal XML. And some formats here are already used, I think, also standards by the European Commission for formalizing meta information of legal documents. But now we're also trying to go to the direction to actually formalize the actual contents of the rules and of the legal statements to work with that. So, for instance, here is a screenshot of a system by Guido Governatori and his group at Data61. They have tools for business compliance, so you can model your process and check via automated reasoning systems whether this is then compliant versus some kind of regulatory statements. I myself, for instance, I was now switching to automation of normative logics, which is then a language for reasoning about normative statements. If something is the case, then you're obliged or allowed or forbidden to do something else. And how can the computer automatically reason with these kind of statements? This is also what I've been now working on the last years. And for instance, here the own projects with a colleague, Thomas Libal, we built a small prototype called Knife for normative AI, where you could annotate documents, trying to formalize them, and then using automated reasoning systems at the back end to reason about user queries. So if, I don't know, I park my car here and there, am I then eligible for a fine because something, right? And this is then evaluated with respect to a formalized legal code. And also quite fresh, a new project of mine, automated reasoning with legal entities, already, where I will try to build a software that will employ then the normative reasoning systems for reasoning about legal documents and legal statements or normative statements more general. Okay, and to get the bridge back to the very beginning where we said the vision is to reason in philosophy and metaphysics and morals just by using a calculator. Also, there's a lot of work going on in the automation of philosophical logic, where, for instance, a former colleague of mine, Chris Benzmiller, with a colleague from Austria, I think he's not now in Australia, but I'm not sure about this, they formalized the ontological God for the ontological proof for the existence of God by Gödel, and actually found an error there and could verify other variants of that. And from this, actually, quite a lot of work emerged, where now automated reasoning, so computer-assisted argumentation, if you want so, in philosophy and theoretical philosophy and metaphysics, is now actually being done. And there are projects where actually a reasoning system is always open at the side as a kind of advisor to advise us if some assumptions that we have are indeed true or not, because they can help us in argumentation. So the question is now, how far have we actually progressed in this initial idea of having a characteristica universalis, so a universal language for doing all these kinds of reasoning and deduction in particular? Well, the initial idea of having logic as a universal language, we could say yes or no. I'm not so sure, but I would say we're not really there, because, as I said earlier, logic is not one thing, but we have a lot of different logical systems, a lot of different logical languages, just like we have different languages, English, French, German, etc. And I now wrote down here some logics that I'm using and I know are being used in that context, and you can see that they're actually, so regardless what they actually mean, But these are a lot of different logical systems. So we haven't progressed in that sense that we have one language to capture all these aspects, but we have a lot of dialects, if you want so. And if this is really already the initial goal, I would argue that it's not. But I think we are going in the right direction here. Okay, so I hope this was interesting to you in this webinar. Now in the last 40 minutes approximately, I talked to you about logical reasoning as a field of AI, which we call symbolic AI. Actually, one of the oldest fields of artificial intelligence research. You've seen aspects on automated reasoning systems, in principle, how they could work and what different systems exist, and also some application examples. And sadly, because of the time constraints, I could only address a few of them. But of course, there are also examples in ethics, AI ethics, explainable AI, all these interesting and really timely, relevant topics, which I could not highlight here in this time. But we've seen some examples, and of course, there are a lot more. Okay, so thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. And yeah, this then marks the end of my talk. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much for the very nice talk, Alexander. It was a very, very good talk. I think quite interesting.
Thanks.
So the audience seems to be quite pleased and to have learned a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, logic is always the right step. So logic is always the first step towards a better life.
And as you said, you can never be wrong with the deductions you make with logic. So.
At least not in a way that the others would understand, because it's so obscure. Yeah, exactly.
That's true.
Okay, so do I need to click something for questions? No, I think this is...
We can switch to the Q&A mode.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay.
Explain more the difference between decide action and explain action. Okay. So of course there's no single right answer to what an action or what a decision or what an explanation is. So of course this is again quite vague in a sense. But what I meant with deciding on actions is that at various points, for instance, in AI systems, the system needs to decide which action to take. So you have some kind of sensors that observe the environment, and now I as an autonomous system need to decide what to do next. And you could argue that you could use deductive reasoning for coming to a deductive conclusion on how to use the information that come from the surroundings on what to do next. So decide action is choose from a possibly infinitely large list of possible actions that I could do now, one single action that I want to execute. For instance, I could either open the door or leave the door closed, or I could instead open the window or leave it closed. What will I do now? And probably in my situation now, I deduce that I will leave my door here closed and my window closed because I'm in a webinar. I observe that I'm in a webinar, and I deduce that it might not be a good idea to leave now here my place and that you're all alone. Of course, you're not alone, but with Jeremy. But this is the decision that I'm talking about, right? We need to come to some kind of decision what a system wants to do or should do. The explaining part is of course related, but not necessarily the same thing. Once an action has been executed, the question is, can we somehow explain, or can we argue why this was a feasible action or a allowed action, or maybe even the best action to take in this moment? And for instance, in logical reasoning, we could then say, yeah, the decision was made because of this deductive chain of argumentation steps. This is then the explanation part. But of course, it doesn't need to be deductive reasoning to explain action. There could also be some trained model from machine learning, and then we need to explain why that model actually classified this picture as a cat and not as a dog, right? And depending on in which system you are, explaining can mean quite something different. And arguably, I would say that explaining why a concrete machine learning model classifies this as a cat and not as a dog is quite hard to do. But I'm not a real expert in deep learning, etc. So maybe there are some good ways of doing that. But what I see usually is that explaining the concrete outputs, why they happen in a machine learning network, is quite hard to do. And in the logical case, well, it's an argumentation. We can just follow the argumentation, right? And this is then explaining why something was done. And of course, both aspects are important, especially if you want to have some kind of reliable AI systems or transparent AI systems that can give us a reason why some action was actually done. I hope this more or less addresses the question. If not, of course, there could be a follow-up.
Sounds like a good answer to me, yeah. So there's something, related question here.
These moves between decide and explain, are they what is also called iterative reasoning? To be honest, I don't know the term iterative reasoning, but what from I would now infer by abductive reasoning is that this is applying some kind of reasoning steps iteratively, and probably also using some prior information that influences my later reasoning steps. But I'm not sure if this was really the question. Decide and explain, they do not necessarily need to be elemental parts in AI systems. One could also say that only decision is important, but it is important that you are able to explain the decision if being asked, right? So that you don't need to explain and decide, because usually I myself as a person also do not explain every action I do. But when being asked, why did you do that? Then I can say, okay, I can now post hoc come up with an explanation that at least tells you that my action that I did was not wrong or bad or whatever. But I'm not sure if this is really the question. So, Jeremy, do you know iterative reasoning?
I'm not sure what is meant here either.
Okay, so sorry about this. So maybe this is just a problem of terminology, but maybe this also addressed this question already. How difficult is it to translate laws into a logical language, especially when the law states that someone needs to do best efforts to prevent something? Yes, this is a very good point. A very simple answer, it's very, very complicated. And this is, of course, why it's not yet being done, at least not full-fledged in the sense, because we are still looking into fundamental principles and ways on how to do that. And there's, as far as I know, not yet agreed upon system or way of doing that, or there's no, so the community has not settled on some kind of approach yet. But of course, there are systems that allow you to do that. And then always the question is the translation, so the logical encoding that I did, is it really what was meant by the law? So by the original text, right? The problem of alignment, this is usually called, I think. This is a real hard problem. So, and of course, this also involves interpretation. Of course, as you might know, or probably you even better than myself, that legal texts are, of course, also quite general, or in a sense, in a controlled language that allows still for interpretation. And this is a strength, of course, of legal texts. But how to represent this. And there are approaches on to encode this as a kind of placeholder-like equivalent in logic, and then later on we can give this some kind of interpretation that is also influenced by the context. And but yeah, so this is still I would say not an open problem, because there are systems that are actually doing this or able to where a human can actually encode this, but there are still some downsides, and of course it's a lot of work. Especially, you need to make sure, of course, that the thing that you encoded is actually that what you wanted to have. So a very long answer for the short summary, very, very difficult. Is a rules engine an example of automated reasoning system? I would say yes. So rules, of course, a rules engine, this is probably also a wording that was prominently used in earlier times of AI research, when we had still this kind of expert systems around. I think this is a term that has been slowly not really been used again in the AI community, but still, of course, the roots are there. And rules engine could be seen as a depending on the rules, depending on the complexity of the rules, of course, as a simple or not so simple automated reasoning system, yes. But of course, there are automated reasoning systems that are not rule engines as such. So, yeah. Are researchers using NLP and machine learning to infer logic from texts, e.g. legal documents, and to then use in a way that you have shown? I think yes. So I think there are approaches. I mean, there are of course approaches in NLP. So NLP is natural language processing, that tries to translate text formulated in natural language to some kind of computer readable format, which could be some kind of logical formalism, of course. And there are, I think, even yearly challenges how good these systems actually are to extract this information. But I'm not sure if this has actually been combined with a more complex reasoning systems or automated deduction system as I'm working on. But I would be surprised if there wouldn't be anything in that direction. So I would say yes. But I think especially the combination of the reasoning systems on one side and the NLP stuff on the other side, this is, of course, a major challenge. Because here you want to have the reliability of using logic or deductive inferences, but encoding this knowledge is very expensive. So you want to use maybe untrusted in a sense translations from natural language to rules. And then again, of course, you can use logic to verify whether this translation fulfills some basic quality measures that you just state some examples that should hold or should not hold, and then you can test whether this automatic translation is actually correct. This is also the direction that the system, the NICE system that I did together with a colleague Tomer, also the direction where we want to go. At the moment, the encoding is still by hand, and this is a lot of work. But we are always happy to find better ways of doing this, and of course, using NLP, this is the obvious next step. Then, yes. Oh, that's a long one. Okay, let me read it out loud. According to provisions contained in the GDPR, in case of automated decision making, a data processor is obliged to give to the concerned person meaningful information about the logic involved, as well as the significance and the envisaged consequences of such processing for the data subject. How can you give such information in a meaningful way as it normally is in machine readable format. Is this provision even enforceable in case of complex automated decision systems? Okay. Let me try to address this one by one. How can you give such information in a meaningful way? You mean the information that I'm now obliged to give out, right? About how data
guess
was
that's
processed.
what is meant here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, in a context of these deduction systems, of course, all is in a way of in a machine readable format. All is already there, right? We have these kind of proofs, so these certificates, whether they are helpful or not. I mean, for a human, this is something different. This can be outputted, of course. The representation and the translation of this to understandable representations for humans, this is again a quite challenging thing. I know that my colleague is also working in that direction to give intuitive or more intuitive representations of that. But of course, you could envision a translation of proofs to a natural language argument. Maybe this natural language argument is then quite long, but still it's a natural language argument, because especially in a naive approach, we could just encode these rules of argumentation, as we called them, like modus ponens, modus tollens, etc., as a template. If A, then B. So an implication is translated in the sentence if A, then B. And then we just translate everything to this. So we have a long document saying if A and B, and it follows that. And this is then a very long document. And of course, this can be done. The next question, of course, is that reasonable to do? And there need to be ways to compress this, or to just get some synopsis of this proof, and this is also being addressed by some research. But I think this is then the direction that one should go into. Is this provision even enforceable in case of complex automatic decision systems? That's a good question. It depends, of course, what this kind of complex automated decision system is. Usually, of course, not every AI system is based on logic, although I would like it to be, but it doesn't make sense, of course, because machine learning has its perfect applications, and of course, it's perfectly reasonable to use. But depending on the ingredients that you use in this complex system, whether it's automated reasoning, like automated deduction, or is it machine learning, it might be harder or simpler to actually get this information and to extract it and to give it to the outside. And maybe in some ways it might even be impossible, I don't know, for complex machine learning systems to really find a human understandable representation of what the machine learning network has done. But this doesn't mean that it's impossible. So there's also now some work where it is an approach to not explain what actually the system has done, but to explain that the output is a feasible output. So like a post hoc application, that we don't try to explain how the system came to a conclusion, but we explain that the conclusion that was given is feasible or valid, well, not valid, but legal,
maybe
in some sense.
Justified, you could say.
Or justified, right? And this can also be done by some kind of controller instance that will look at this automated system and decide whether this system does something meaningful or not, and then tries to argue, or maybe even as like an ethical, legal, logical governor, tries to forbid actions that seem not legal for this control instance, or explain the things that are considered legal or feasible. Yeah. So a clear yes, no, I would say, right?
I think there's also quite a big issue with this, the ambiguity of the word meaningful.
Yeah,
in this law, which, I mean, also depends who, meaningful for who. I mean, you could say meaningful to a human, but that's not that's still very unclear.
Exactly correct. Yeah.
So
of course there's a big problem on a granularity of these outputs, on details. So what might be reasonable for the financing department of some company might not be meaningful for a person, like an individual person, or for some office of the government. So you have different views maybe on the same subject. I think this is also called aspects. And other groups are looking at how to represent the same information with different aspects. But yeah, so this is of course also a big issue that needs to be discussed, right? So as you can see, like in this example, AI systems or even logic, for that matter, it's always a team play area, right? Because there are a lot of application domains, and logicians cannot be experts in law or in ethics and in something else. So the important thing is here, of course, to have an active interchange of what is actually needed in some application domain and what can be done and how we can balance this, right?
Yeah. Okay, very good. I think we're starting to reach the time limit. I think maybe just one last question there.
Can you recommend any books for beginners to logic in AI? Yes. I actually know quite a few good books, I would say. Some are more formal and some others are a bit less formal. But I cannot tell you the name right now from the top of my head. But I do own them. I have them here somewhere. And maybe we could just post some names on the Reddit, because I guess this is then easier, right?
Yeah. Then we can put a list of books that you recommend on the Reddit page.
Yeah. Without being affiliated with any of the authors or the companies. So this is just my personal impression, of course, then in the books. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Then then we will post this a bit later today. Okay. So let's end on this. So thank you again very much, Alexander, for giving us this very interesting talk today.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Pleasure to have you. And then thank you everyone for joining, and have a nice rest of the day. We will see you next week.